All right, good afternoon, everyone. It is 2 o'clock here in Chicago. We'll probably have a couple of people coming in, but it's now 2:01, so we'll get started. My name is Jonathan Hadley. I'm technical host today, uh, and pleased to present Craig Wiggins. Today is the last of the offerings the program committee of the Rudolf Steiner branch of Chicago has prepared for the Holy Nights. And we are pleased and thankful that you can join us. I'll briefly introduce Craig. He's spoken with us once already this season, um, but all the same, he's from. Oh, let me mute this. Sorry. And while I'm at it, let me make sure everyone's muted. Okay, thank you. We've already got 58 people here, and we're likely to have many more. So, in order to maintain order, I'm going to keep everyone muted until the question and answer period. Thank you for your patience, and I hope you understand. All right. So, uh, Craig was raised in Joplin, Missouri. He joined the Holy Order of Nuns in Chicago in 1975 and transitioned to anthroposophy in the Christian community. He's ministered in Germany and the Netherlands and was ordained in 1992. Uh, and he's also had involvement with the Waldorf community and is a Waldorf granddad. He presently serves here in Chicago and is a linker or executive director of the North American region of the Christian community. Thank you again for joining us, and I'll hand everything over to Craig, please.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan, and welcome to everyone. Thank you for taking time on this Tuesday afternoon or evening, or if you're listening much later, to take time in a way to celebrate the last day of the Holy Nights. It's a cusp, as the astrologers like to say. We're just in this turning point, moving from the celebration of the Holy Nights, the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, moving into this season we call Epiphany. And a lot of that's going to ring through this afternoon in the things I have to say. You read in the announcement, Prologue to the Gospel of John, Working from Christ. Now, the first time I spoke, 12 nights ago, 12 days, something like that, it was called by Jesus Christ. And that is with intention that I have turned those names around. Perhaps that will become clear in the course of what I'm saying, if not, it up in the Q&A later. And as often happens when you create a title and think you have a topic for a presentation like this, I don't know when that was, way back in November, it makes perfect sense at the time that I come up with it. And as the Holy Nights have progressed, we've been working with the prologue to the Gospel of John here in the Christian community in Chicago in the mornings after the act of consecration of man, sitting together and pondering one or two words sometimes, or a phrase, or conjuring up the picture that a particular word awakens in our hearts, and sharing that with each other. That's been very joyful, very inspiring. And you notice how deep and how broad and how rich this prologue to the Gospel of John is. And at the same time, this joyfulness has led me to that particular picture, joy. You know, these things can get heavy. Anthroposophy, practicing anthroposophy, can weigh heavily on our heart and mind. We feel duty bound to work hard and to do our best, to do our exercises, and that's all good. That's wonderful that we're doing that. And at the same time, I've run across a number of sayings of the Christ Jesus that I want to share in a minute. Point to this phenomenon of joy as being a kind of goal, something maybe we see off in the distance, or it can be an emotion that we feel within and don't quite recognize. Let's see if we get there. I do want to begin with the prologue, and especially the very last two words. So try to stay awake that long. Prologue to the Gospel of John, the first 18 verses, excuse me. In beginning was the Word, and the Word was turned towards God, and God was the Word. This was in beginning, turned towards God. All came into being through the Word, and without it, nothing comes into being. Came into being through the Word was life, and the light for human beings. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness comprehends it not. There came into existence a human being, sent from God, his name, John. He came as witness, to bear witness to the light, so that through him all may believe. He was not that light, but came to bear witness to the light. For the true light that enlightens all humanity was coming into the world. It was in the world, and the world came into being through it, but the world had not recognized it. Into individual people the word had come, but the individuals did not take it into themselves. But all who did take it in received spiritual authority to become children of God. Those who trusted its name are born, not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of the human being. They are born of God. And the Word became flesh and took up its abode in us, and we beheld its revelation, the revelation of the one-born Son of the Father, full of grace and truth. Now this word, grace, charitas, appears to me to be related to the word for joy, charos. And it just so happens last evening when I was assembling my notes and thoughts for this afternoon, I browsed YouTube for some music, and what pops up is Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which has as its fourth movement a choral addition to the instrumental part, and that is the musical version of Schiller's Ode to Joy, An die Freude. And it was a true joy to listen to that, to allow these words to go through my soul, and of course the exceptional music that Beethoven wrote, his last symphony. He was completely deaf when he wrote it, so you can say he wrote this music completely with his inner, we might dare to say, his spiritual hearing. And perhaps a little bit of that spiritual hearing we can also tune into this afternoon. We don't have to become deaf in our mechanical ears, but the ears of our heart open a little bit to this joy, this charitas, this charas, and truth. Maybe truth comes another time. We'll talk about that around Easter. This joy, this grace, you could also beauty, harmony, the gift from the cosmos to the human being. Now you might remember, those who were here last time, we spoke about how the Gospel of John proceeds and how John the baptizer pointed to Jesus as he walked by, having been very, very recently baptized by John. Two disciples of John were standing there, Andrew and an other disciple. Andrew and the other disciple follow Jesus. They find Philip and Nathanael and Peter. These five are called to follow Jesus. We hear in the Gospel of Matthew that Matthew, Levi, as he's called, is called away from his table where he's collecting taxes. So these 6 people are named by name. We hear about their calling by Jesus of Nazareth, their following. We spoke of that. And the others are named later by name. We don't hear the story of their calling. And then the work proceeds. These men, 12 men, enter into an intimate community with Jesus of Nazareth. They form a group of 13 men who travel from city to city. One has to almost picture this inwardly and feel the motion, feel the excitement that arose in the small villages or in the larger cities, in Jerusalem, for example, when this teacher and his 12 disciples, and it's told that many other people followed them, when this individual would walk into a city and perhaps simply sit down somewhere at the marketplace, surrounded by his 12 disciples, and either begin to speak, or people had already heard of his healing powers, would come to him, those who were ill, those who had a limb that didn't work or had lost one of their senses, blindness, deafness, tragedies. These disciples were then gathered around Jesus and would witness his deeds. They would, and this is my imagination, they would experience, I think, even in their own bodies, in their inner experience, but into their life forces and their soul forces. They must have experienced something of the healing powers, the powers of harmony and we might say rightness that could enter into a human being through the person of Jesus of Nazareth. They formed a community, you might say, of pupils, students, those who wished not only to follow Jesus and just walk behind him wherever he went and perhaps serve his needs and gather food and look for places to sleep and such things, but that this inner circle of the 12 began to consider themselves not only followers, but actual pupils, those who have attached themselves to a teacher with various qualities. And we hear again and again that people were amazed at what, and that is a little odd in one way, because in biblical times there were many healers. There were many people who had learned through years of study to heal with their hands or with the word. But Jesus of Nazareth was known to be a carpenter. He had not gone to any healing school to learn, to lay on hands, or to speak words, or to concoct poultices or anything else. And this amazement that the people showed when he healed comes from this, but wait, he's not really a healer. He's not trained for this, and yet he's doing it. Where is this coming from? And this must have awakened an amazing amount of not only astonishment, but also reverence is almost too weak a word. I can't come up with anything else. A kind of honoring this presence of this human being who, without any formal training, could heal, could speak a word, and we would see who had been bent over or cramped or losing blood or even dying, restored to the full powers of life. And when we say in the John Gospel, in the Word was life, there we see how this Word is not only some magnificent cosmic being that surrounds the entire universe, that is it also, but that this Word is spoken by a human being on the earth, in the earth, to earthly human beings. And that this Word begins to penetrate into the life forces, into the physical reality of human beings on the earth. And the 12 disciples not only witness this, my idea has slowly become that they begin to experience these forces within themselves, and that we might say they become a kind of intern at some point. And I'm sure many of us in our professional development have learned things, theory, books, gone to school, gone to college, gone to training programs, and then at some point they shove you out of the, they take the books out of your hands, and they assign you to a master, a teacher, a mentor, and that mentor will assess your abilities in this and will throw you before a client or a customer or put you on a project that you need to work on yourself. And that's where I have experienced myself as an intern in a couple of different professions. You begin to examine yourself, well, what can I actually do? What is living in me of this particular ability? For example, as a student at the priest seminary, you're sent to work at a children's camp. Now, I had small children myself at that time, but I was not really all that familiar what to do with children between 10 and 14 years old. I had worked with teenagers, I had worked with very small children, I had worked with very old people, but I had never really worked with this particular age group. And so it was that I was the cook, and I would have 8 little girls, 10-year-old girls, come into the kitchen to help me with dinner. And I'm standing there with a big spoon in my hand and an enormous pot, and well, you just start giving orders like, you fill the pot with water, and you weigh out 5 kilos of beans, and you over there, see those carrots? Start peeling them. Well, of course, immediately she cuts her finger, and anyway, you see what I mean? As an intern, this stage between learning, reading, studying, and actually being able to independently practice your profession, I think that's where the disciples were for the first year or so. They were learning, and then at some point, we'll get to that later, not quite yet, we have to hold on for just a minute. This internship, I would compare it with anyone who's going through a process of initiation. And then a real initiation, like the old days, going into the dark and being trained and worked on and from the world, and all of those things that we hear about the pre-Christian initiations. But they were going through this right in front of everybody else, in front of each other, all 12 of them. I imagine they were together day and night, traveling, sleeping in some sort of configuration, cooking together, eating, looking for water, looking for food, following the lead of Jesus Christ, taking care of him. And at the same time, each of these acts of healing that he performed, and there were many, many, many more than the ones we know about in the Gospels, I'm quite sure, that every time this healing word was spoken, this word of life right into the darkness of a suffering human being, that each time part of the The disciple fell away. So that we might say this first part of the initiation process, the learning, the study, that was taking part. And at the same time, this what's often called the purification or the catharsis, where the old being, the old habits, the old attitudes, even to a certain extent, the family left behind. At a certain point, someone wants to follow Jesus, and this individual says, well, let me first bury my father who has died. And this, one of the many Bible words that almost everyone knows, let the dead bury their dead. You come and follow me. Or the rich young man searching for eternal life and heard from Jesus, go and sell all that you have and give the proceeds to the poor. And the young man became very sad because he was exceedingly rich. That would have meant a major turnaround in his life. That would have meant lots of people looking at him and thinking he's lost his mind. What? He gave everything away and he's following this carpenter from Nazareth? He wasn't quite ready yet to leave everything behind. That would be another story, another time. So in short, I wandered a little bit from the John Gospel into the Matthew Gospel, I have to confess. And if you look around the first, let's say the chapters 4 through 8, more or less, we have there the very first deeds of Christ, calling the disciples, many healings, many teachings, and especially what's known as the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5 through 7. And then chapter 8 is full of healings. Healing of someone who had leprosy, the son of the centurion, the mother-in-law of Peter, and so on and so forth. So many of these instances where you might say this learning, but also at the same time, this purification, this catharsis of the disciples is taking place. Sailing across the sea and experiencing how in their souls, the storm that came up frightened them to death. And remember, in some of the old initiations, there was this moment where the person would be suddenly frightened. Did that work? Did you get suddenly frightened out there? Probably not. Have to do a lot more. Have to make it completely dark. And it's quite a technical feat in the old initiations to frighten someone almost to death. It's not the intention that they actually die, but that their bodies become, that they begin to experience what does it mean to be not only contained in my physical material body, but also to be able to get out of it, to leave it behind consciously. This was beginning to happen, I think, in this sailing across the sea at night, when the storm comes up and the disciples don't know what to do, and they finally awaken their master, and he calms the storm. Again, one of those stages of purification, catharsis, beginning to make the soul pliable and open and receptive for the spiritual powers. To begin to realize, what does it mean to be dead? How much dead stuff am I carrying around with me as a pupil of Jesus or a follower of Rudolf Steiner, for example, to say something that probably affects most of us here. Let the dead bury their dead. When the things of the past are holding us back, that's when we realize we've got to deal with those things. We've got to let go of them. And this is where a particular part of our being begins to awaken that we call the I. and not just the I that sort of reacts to whatever's going on around it, but that being, which is also strongly connected to our higher I, that begins to take charge of our life and say, this is what I want. Now I know what I want. And I'm beginning to find out what to do to achieve that. And that I, that especially that higher part of our being, is intimately connected with the Christ. He is, in a way, our I, our higher I. The pupil needs to lose the ground under their feet, is another way of entering into this state of catharsis. It happened too in my internship. I was sent to work in a psychiatric hospital in the Black Forest in Germany. And I had a great time. I learned a lot about taking care of people and being empathetic and listening, administering anthroposophical remedies, but also the applications, the poultices, the various baths and things. And I thought it was all wonderful, and not particularly that I didn't lose the ground under my feet. And then I had a conversation with priests at the seminary afterwards, looking back over this time. And I was just telling him what had gone on and what I had learned and experienced. And at some point, I asked him, well, sir, what was your intention with sending me to work in the psychiatric hospital? And he kind of sighed and said, well, we did intend for you to lose your steady footing on the earth, but it didn't happen. Maybe I'm still trying. But this idea that the earth doesn't carry me, that I carry me. This is an experience that one needs when one enters into spiritual work of any kind, at any level. I carry me. It's not egotistical. It's absolutely necessary. And it helps us then awaken that this I within us and this I above us, that these two work together and begin to awaken to the world around us, but also to have a firm anchor in the spiritual world, in the spiritual work. That when we begin to receive impressions in our meditative work, in my case, in the celebration of the sacraments, when the spiritual world begins to speak to us, and believe me, it does, that we don't lose our footing, literally or figuratively, that we don't stumble, that we don't enter into hysteria or get lost, but remain firmly footed in ourselves. It's a new relationship to the spiritual world. And we begin to realize the heavens are not out there somewhere. They are in here too. But our experience of the heavens will be within ourselves, which of course is not to take away from the beauty of observing the stars at night, or a sunrise, or a sunset, or a full moon. Absolutely. And those are moments when we can connect, actually, perhaps even stronger, to that sunrise within us. And the Matthew Gospel goes on. In the 9th chapter, I would say the view of the disciples has grown broader. They see more healings. They experience, for example, Christ as a guest of Matthew, the tax collector, remember, this hated individual. And then something that can easily get lost in our civilized society is that Christ, to those who were in need, he didn't with the higher ups, with the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the experts in the law, certainly not with the Roman emperor or the Roman governor. He was not included in those circles. He went actively to those who were in pain, in need, those who were in need of healing. I just wonder, when we think from our anthroposophical perspective, if within the disciples, something of their own destiny, karma, whatever you like to call it, something of their calling, their inner mission, is slowly beginning to awaken. One would hope so. Because also in these, especially in this 9th chapter, a certain connection begins to appear between the healings of the physical, of the mental situations, and the connection to the healing of destinies. And this is perhaps the most difficult thing to express, and it took me years to understand it, so bear with me. When Jesus healed an individual, let's say a person who was inflicted with leprosy. We know this is a very disfiguring disease. One loses the extremities, whole limbs. It's very devastating. Try to imagine that when Christ Jesus heals an individual suffering or living with leprosy, this individual becomes an archetype for all human beings suffering from attacks from without, or suffering from an internal karmic condition that is working itself out through the skin, through the limbs, through the extremities. That this healing becomes not only a deed for that one individual, but that it stretches, it expands into all of humanity who suffer from similar afflictions, and becomes a part of the new fabric of humanity that will slowly begin to weave itself as we move toward the resurrection, as the resurrection will spread throughout the civilized world. Another story, we'll get there at Easter time. That each of these healings, be it a leper, be it with the issue of blood, someone with the moon disease, lunacy, as we would call it, epilepsy nowadays. All of these healings are very much that individual person, but also part of the whole fabric of the new humanity that is slowly developing. And this is the new humanity that is slowly freeing itself from the old. So it's not only the individual disciples, the 12, who are going through this catharsis, this purification process, this burning away of what has part of their life, but I would say all of humanity is slowly going through this kind of initiation, so that the resurrection forces, when they begin to spread out, will have pure and willing receptacles throughout the civilized world, which back then was around the Mediterranean pretty much. Rome and Greece and Israel and Egypt, Northern Africa, slowly moving into the east, moving to the northwest. That each of these individuals becomes a kind of a prism for the healing forces of to enter into humanity as a whole. Slowly but surely, as these individuals become purified, letting go of the bonds of the blood and family, they form new community. They form community which comes together by choice, not the community that I have with my sisters because we have the same mother. It's a lovely community. My sisters, I think they like me too. And we get along well. And when we see each other, we can talk for hours. And yet I know that's not where I belong to serve the whole of my particular life, or theirs for that matter. And all three of us have branched out all over the place. So that was much more difficult in biblical times. It was not at all usual that the son, and certainly not the daughter of the house, would branch out into any other part of the country, would marry into another family. The extended families were very large. So love, Rudolf Steiner tells us, could only express itself within the blood relationships where people recognized each other very unconsciously. Marriages were arranged mostly. So this is another part of letting go of the old, becoming pure and receptive for the new, healing the weaknesses that had come about in humanity, awakening what had died or what was threatening to die, purifying what had come from outside, what had come to contaminate the pure impulses, and also to come to terms with the evil spirits, with the demonic forces, that were very present. Those of you who are familiar with the so-called Fifth Gospel, these series of lectures that Rudolf Steiner gave mostly in 1913. It just so happens we're studying those here in Chicago in the evenings. So it's kind of fresh in my mind, this picture of the circle of disciples who at some point in their building of community became so similar to each other that no one from outside their circle could tell them apart, and could actually even not tell who was Jesus, who was John, who was Peter, who was James, who was Bartholomew, who was Thaddeus, who was Judas. That they formed such a community that their outer appearance, in any case, became as one, that like 13lings, what would we call those? We have twins and triplets and quadruplets. I'm making this up now. 13 peas in a pod, we'll call them that were so similar that people from outside their circle never quite knew who was speaking when one of them was speaking. Was it Jesus speaking through the body of Jesus of Nazareth, or was he speaking through one of the other disciples? It must be a wonderful instrument to work with if you're the master of it. And so this founding of the circle of disciples, this initiation into a chosen group of human beings, of these cosmic forces that we hear about in the prologue, the life, the light shining in the darkness, the word which awakens faith in us. The word becomes flesh and dwells among us. Literally pitches its tent in us. One of the ways to translate that. It becomes a community of beings, the like of which has never existed before. You might even say this is the first time that this process of initiation begins to take place in full view of the public, without the public having the vaguest notion of what's going on, as they perhaps see Jesus of Nazareth walking through Israel with his friends. And then slowly but surely in this community, we enter into that part of the initiation process that's often called communion. Communion. The purification has taken place. They've slowly transformed into pure instruments for the cosmic forces. And they have formed a community that can bear this impulse, that can carry this energy and carry this mission into the world. And of course, people notice. John, the baptizer, sends people to Jesus and asks, are you the one that we've been waiting for, or should we wait for somebody else? And Jesus says, well, go and tell John what you've seen and heard. The lame are healed, the blind are healed, the deaf are healed. Those who are dead have been awakened. And again, we can say these are individual human beings being healed, restoring their sight, restoring their hearing, giving them the ability to walk. We can also say humanity itself is slowly being restored, or actually given perhaps even new abilities to see, to hear, to move, so that not only the sense powers are being awakened, sight, hearing, so on, but also the will is being awakened. And here we might say, John, when he heard this, I hope, that he might have had the feeling, I have fulfilled my mission. I've not only announced his coming, I've been able to spread the word, literally to spread the word, and awaken, at least in some human beings, at least those who are close to Jesus of Nazareth, who was his cousin, a relative, a brother, a friend. And so John then, around this time, was already in prison. And it happened then that Herod was having a birthday party. And I think this story is quite well known. The daughter of his mistress danced for him, and he promised her anything she wanted, as much as half of his kingdom. The girl asks her mother, as a teenage girl might do when confronted with a difficult question she didn't have a spontaneous answer for. And the mother, of course, was very angry at John, who had told them in no terms that they had no business being together because she was still married to her husband. She was so angry that she decided to take revenge on John and whispers in the girl's ear, ask for his head on a platter. And the girl goes to the king and asks for the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And this man, of course, cannot do anything else. Many guests have witnessed the whole scene. So John's life comes to an end. He is beheaded. He's presented on a platter. And then something happens that we can infer from the gospel stories, but which was spoken very expressly by Rudolf Steiner, that once the earthly life of John the Baptist had ended, his body was buried, his spirit then was free, but that his inner being did not go the way of all other human beings after death, namely moving through the planetary spheres and staying out into the cosmic realms for 800 years, but that this spiritual being, the spiritual entity of John the Baptizer, remained not only in the sphere of the earth, but very specifically in the sphere of the 12 disciples. And that this group of disciples then received as its, you might say, its patron of its community, the spiritual entity of John, who went with them, ministered with them, spoke with them, worked with them. Because the very first thing that happens after this beheading of John, is the disciples are sent out 2 by 2, out into the world. And this is the exciting moment when they become interns. They are no longer pupils sitting at the feet of their master, but he has given pairs of them the task of going forth to preach the word. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. The one that we've been waiting for has come to heal the sick, to comfort the sorrowing. And they go and they do this. He tells them to take nothing with them. No second set of clothes, no sack with food, no second pair of shoes, and always to rely on what give them where they come. Even this amusing little side note, and if they don't listen to you, leave their city and shake your feet, shake the dust of their city off of your feet as a sign against them. And this must have been we don't really hear that in the gospel story, but if we apply our own human feeling to this, I would say the disciples were probably pretty daunted at this point to leave their master behind. We know nothing of what he was doing in this time. We don't know how long it lasted or where they went exactly. Again, this is very much an archetypical picture of the pupil who has stood with their master, learned from their master, has been in a way in a process of initiation by their master, and is now being put to the very practical test. Has anything that I've worked with stuck? Is it still there? Can it work through you? Are you able to activate these forces? Are you able to work from Christ? Are you, dear disciples, dear 12, able to go forth and 2 by 2, so they're not completely alone? Are you able to wake up forces with the power of your own eye in order to enter a village, to look around, to listen to people, to speak with people, to lay your hands upon those who are afflicted with the one or the other disease or ailment or impediment or handicap or disability? And they come back joyful. This is one of the first expressions of joy in the Matthew Gospel. They rejoice at what they've been able to do. And Jesus does something which I think is something every teacher should remember, print in their techniques. He takes his student into himself, withdraws to be with them, to help them regenerate, to recuperate, you might say, to rejuvenate from their internship, to, you might say, to drink at the pure fountain of his love and his energy. And then they notice there are a whole lot of other people there. All of these people have somehow found their way to this place where Jesus is together with his disciples. And Jesus begins to speak with them, to teach them. And as the evening draws near, one of the disciples points out that it's getting dark, it's getting late, and one should send all these people away so they can find a place to sleep, they can get some food, they can take care of themselves. And we hear, I believe it's the John Gospel where this is so expressed so pointedly by Jesus, you feed them. Panic. The disciples look around and they find a young fellow that has some fish and some bread. And then it's Andrew who says, but what is that for so many? And then Jesus does something rather surprising. He has down in groups of 50, creating order in this mass of people. We're only going to hear at the end how many were there. And he takes the fish and the bread, and the Greek word is beautiful. It's the same word that the word Eucharist comes from. He spoke the prayer of thanksgiving. And then he hands this nourishment to the disciples, and they hand it out to all of the people. And at the end of this meal, all of those people are completely satisfied, and there are 12 baskets of bread left over. And it's then noted at the very end of this story, there were 5,000 men present, which leads to the assumption that there were also women and children present. Lots of people had received nourishment. Whether this became physical nourishment, whether it lives in the plane of spiritual fulfillment, I'm leaving that open. I think both are true. We see then how this being of Christ, this logos, this creative force, has become its own entity. In beginning, at that moment when time begins, when movement begins to take place into the world, the logos, the word, speaks. And in the word was life, and the life becomes the light for human beings. The light shines in the darkness. And I generally think that when we say darkness, we mean the material earth in its incarnation as we know it today. This thick, dense, impenetrable stuff that we live on and work with and put into books and computers and things like that. That being has completely taken over one human being and has become completely part of it. The word has become flesh and creates its abode within us. And that word shines in the darkness of humanity that is searching for the way to re-enliven the light in itself, and finds an answer in these 12 human beings. Later in the rich young man, but we tell that story another time. And these human beings also, to a certain extent, to the extent that they are able to do in this lifetime, they are able to allow this life, this light to penetrate their particular version of darkness, each individual. And each of those individuals and the Christ are able to bring this light into the darkness of suffering humanity. And suffering humanity slowly also begins to awaken, each at their own pace, wherever they may be, whatever their individual mission on the earth may be. This Christ consciousness begins to awaken in them. And this is really a pattern for us. Whatever stage each of us might be in our work with anthroposophy, with working with the words Rudolf Steiner has given, the exercises he's given, however close or distant you may be from others who share the same striving. We are in this together. And it's so wonderful that now in this very uncomfortable time of the corona epidemic, pandemic, that we have this possibility to connect with each other through the airwaves. To me, it's still a miracle that I can look on the screen. Jonathan, I've seen in real life, and a few of you I have also, but there are many of you, I've maybe heard your name somewhere. We might be friends on Facebook, or we're following each other on Instagram. All of these connections are taking place, and you can say, oh, it's just all illusion, real, maybe. But you can also look at it as something of my interest in these individuals actually does stream out through the world of thoughts, through the world of light, through the fact that perhaps evening both of us are looking up at the Saturn and Jupiter conjunction, and our hearts open up in amazing expression of awe and reverence. Is that not also a bond that forms this new community? Some of us may never even meet each other in person, but we are together. We form this community, this weird cyber virtual community that is now coming into being more and more. So, joy. I'll just say one more word about joy, or one or two words. Since we're moving into the period of Epiphany, those of us who will tomorrow and for the next 4 Sundays be celebrating the activation of man, we'll start out with the Gospel according to Matthew. Of course, now with this, we go way back before to the time when Jesus was just born. And these wise ones from the East have followed a great constellation that they've been aware of for maybe for centuries. And it seems to be fulfilling itself. They come, I'll shorten the story now because the time is running out. They come to the house where the child is. And if you look in the Matthew Gospel in the 2nd chapter, one has the impression that the star has disappeared. They have to go to King Herod to find out what the wise ones of Jerusalem can tell them, where they need to go to find this child. They go on their way, and the star is present again and has come to rest above a particular house. And this is now Matthew 2, verses 10 and 11. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. They rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. This sounds like kind of double indemnity or whatever, but imagine these 3 individuals, we assume there were 3, had studied the stars for centuries and the wisdom that had been passed down by their forebears, and on and on and on, that this particular constellation would appear. And as Rudolf Steiner tells us, this part of the Christ was already embodying itself, so that not just the Jesus child, but that this force, this life, light, was beginning to approach the earth. We rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. They go into the house and see the child with Mary, its mother, fall down and worship it, and open their treasures, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And just imagine these treasures not only as outer material substances, but as the foundation of what this child later is going to bring into the world as Jesus of Nazareth, as Christ Jesus, as the center of this community. Qualities of gold, of frankincense, of myrrh would be another talk. I think we did something with that last year, if I remember rightly, here in Chicago in any case. Those are wonderful things to occupy yourself with in this time of Epiphany. That the foundation was laid so early with really tangible material that has a spiritual eminence. And the spiritual eminence has carried through to our day if we stop and reflect on these things. So that was a bit of a look into my little workshop here as I try to make sense out of the various things that are going on around us, going on within us, taking place between us and among us. And perhaps the one or the other of you has a comment or a question. Let's see. People love what we're saying right now. Yeah, thank you. That's lovely. I may have been unclear about something, or you want to know more. I don't know everything, but maybe we can say something.
Thank you very much, Craig. I've allowed people to unmute if you have a question. A system that seems to be working too is if you either state your question in the chat or state that you have a question in the chat, then we can call on you. And for those on the phone, *6 will unmute yourself, and *9 indicates that you'd like to speak. So yeah, please, questions, and thank you again, Craig.
You're welcome.
All right, I see a hand virtually raised for Jeanette, if you'd like to unmute.
Yes. Thank you, Greg. Am I on mute?
You are. I hear you.
All righty. I have a little question here, what is very important for me and for everybody maybe. The heavens are in our heart. And you say also, yeah, you can experience maybe in a sunrise. It's of course a big mystery, but I always thought the heavens were in the cosmic realms. So is it both in your heart? You have to see it in your heart and the cosmic realms? It's a big question.
Well, if we want to follow Jesus Christ, which is not a bad idea, he said the kingdom of the heavens is within you. So what was he talking about?
True.
Talking about perhaps not stars and planets in the material sense of the word, but those forces that those beings project into the cosmos that we can become aware of. Some of us are more aware of those than others because we actually spend time studying the outer circumstances.
So much, yeah.
And you become more aware of how that works within us. If we say astrology or astrosophy, as it is called in the more anthroposophical, where I'm a total zero. I know nothing about those things. So don't ask me about the technical stuff, but that those heavenly forces, and it can actually begin even with the feeling that you are bigger than your physical material substance. I often ask this when I'm speaking with someone who wants to become a member of the Christian community or wants to orient themselves. It's when was the first time you ever realized that you are bigger than you are?
Mm-hmm. And the love for Christ is the heavens also.
That's certainly part of it. You might say he's the center of the heavens.
Center. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
You're welcome. Let's see, what else have we got going there?
And while you're looking too, I just want to mention real quick, we are recording today's session, so if you have a question but would rather not be recorded, say the word and we'll edit you out before posting it anyway.
Craig, I have a question.
Yes.
Can we compare the phenomena you were talking about of the Christ in you coming in, uniting, and then all his pupils, disciples, or were even physically similar by time? Because this also happens with married couples that love each other for a long, long time, that then they start seeing, also they have this physical transformation.
Mm-hmm.
But is this union like when the mother and his child, the etheric body of both or of the mother is one? Could that be similar to that, Craig?
You might actually say that in a community, whether it be the community of disciples around Jesus, or even you might even experience that in a study group or in a group that travels together, that you begin to form a kind of common etheric body with each other. With the mother and child, it would be there by nature, I would say. Whereas if the married couple that you're talking about, they wouldn't have that by nature, but it would begin to come into being simply by the fact of eating, sleeping, living together, working together, raising children together, perhaps, or not. So those are kind of two different versions of the same thing. This common etheric body that can come about among human beings. Is that kind of what you meant?
Yes, thank you, Craig. Very clear.
Right. What else do we have here? Oh yeah, access to the recording. So someone is asking, Kay Kemsler, I've heard the idea that the child was born in the cave that the innocents were murdered in. I have no idea. The child described in the Matthew Gospel was most likely born in a house. And the child described in the Luke Gospel was probably born because it said he was laid in a manger because there was no room in the inn. You can read different descriptions. That manger might have been a cave where animals were kept. It could have been actually a structure that was built. That's one of those many historical facts that we simply don't know. The only indication about the Luke child is he was laid in a manger because there was no room in the inn. So we hear manger and we think a crib where animals are fed. Of course, there's all sorts of legends built up around that, but I just go back to the Bible every time.
Craig, can I have a comment on that?
Yes.
Christ was born in Bethlehem, and in Hebrew, Bethlehem, means a house of bread.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have the bread and the wine. Those are symbols to me. So even being born in Bethlehem might even indicate something with the mystical part of the bread.
Mm-hmm.
So he was born in the bread, or with the bread, or bringing the bread, or I can't explain it. It's very difficult. It's just a thought I had once I was studying this.
Thank you. That's an enrichment to remember that house of bread. Yeah, and then gold, frankincense, and myrrh. That would be a whole long story. Maybe I can try just something brief. Gold, of course, is a substance that is mined out of the earth. We don't just pick it someplace or get it. We don't just have gold. It's a substance that has to be mined and put together and somehow worked with before it becomes useful. Of course, it's useful in many ways. It's used as money. It's used as, in our Christian community, our chalice where the wine for the service is poured into is washed in gold, so to speak. A layer of gold is on the inside and the outside. And gold wants to shine. It wants to be seen, which is always sort of a horrible thing when you think of our Fort Knox in the United States, where all these tons and tons and tons of gold are hidden away somewhere under the earth. That's another story. Frankincense is something actually very beautiful. I don't have any right here close. Frankincense is the rosin of the Boswellia plant and is usually harvested in areas where there's lots of sunshine. So we could say lots of sun energy goes into the Boswellia plant. Let's say mostly Ethiopia and Somalia, so the Horn of Africa, where the sunshine is intense. And the frankincense is also, there are many healing qualities, and we would need one of our doctors. I don't know if there's an anthroposophical doctor on the call. They would be able to say more about that. And myrrh is known to be very bitter. So if you think of the last time you bit into let's see, what's bitter? What's a bitter plant? The chicory or some of the cabbage sorts have a bitterness. It's not sour, but it's bitter. And it pulls you together. And this is also part of a healing process, is when the person who is ill is more in this kind of dissolution process, that something bitter can pull you together. And if you think a little bit farther, bringing this myrrh plant to the child is a little bit of a, what's the word? A prediction or an indication of what's coming toward him. He will be the bearer of the sun forces as the Christ. So the gold will become part of his being. The frankincense, the sun forces moving through a material being, through material object, frankincense, healing forces coming through a being, coming from the sun through an incarnated being. And the myrrh being that power that can, what's the word? That can consolidate the I forces within the person so that the human being, whatever ailment might have been or their condition, can begin to take charge of their own life through their own I. That can be a bitter experience because no one else is doing it for you now. You've got to do it yourself. It's sort of like growing up, becoming an adult. Maybe just very briefly, otherwise we would have a very long conversation. Yeah, St. Francis, one of his many contributions to humanity is the creche. This idea that we recreate at Christmas time, the scene, as we can kind of imagine it thanks to the Luke Gospel, this scene that the child was born in a very impoverished surroundings, stable, cave, whatever it might be. And it was Francis of Assisi, as far as we know, who is the first one who recreated this scene in a church. And that church is still there in Italy. And it just so happens that I was on a hiking vacation through this area where Francis of Assisi lived and worked. And I slept one night in front of that creche. It's still there, or it's there again. And the funny thing was, in the morning I woke up and it was so hard, the floor, and I thought, that's odd. I had a lovely air mattress, but the air mattress had sprung a leak during the night, all the air out, and somehow I thought maybe St. Francis didn't find it such a good idea that I was sleeping there, right in front of his creche. I don't know. But it is there, you can see it. I don't remember the name of the city or the church, but it's still around. And people still love to do that, create the creche at Christmas time. Who was that who asked? Vivian.
Can you hear me?
Yes?
Oh, if I can point out that Francis himself was born in a place where cattle were kept. Oddly enough, in Assisi, St. Francis. Himself, his mother was carrying him, and she was heading back to her home, and had to deliver at a place where the cattle were kept. And it was a room, large, it wasn't large, but and it was on. If you go there now, you can actually see it. It's very interesting. But she brought into life in that place. Yeah.
I didn't know that. I only knew he was born in a very wealthy family.
Yeah.
And interesting enough that his actual birth should take place in a place that's not particularly considered with wealth or luxury. Very interesting. Thank you for that biographical tidbit. Yeah. Gold is the fallen earthly representation of wisdom. That just might be. Lots of interesting comments here. Yeah, we can also leave it at that for today. It's an ongoing story. We'll never be finished with this one.
It's true. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming, sharing part of our afternoon together. And I wish you a blessed transition from the Holy Nights into the period of Epiphany. Lots
Thank
to
you.
think about. All
Thank
right.
you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
See you
Craig.
next time, whenever that may be.
Thank you so much, Craig.
You're welcome.